Welcome to Green Building Matters, the podcast that matters for green building professionals. Learn insight in green buildings as we interview today's experts in LEED and WELL. We'll learn from their career paths, war stories, and all things green, because green building matters. And now our host, and yes, he has every LEED and WELL credential. Here's Charlie Cicchetti.
Be sure to check out the Green Building Matters community, where you can have unlimited exam prep for any of the professional credential exams you're tackling next, as well as putting your continuing education on autopilot, saving time with GBS reporting your hours on your behalf. Check it out, gbes.com/join. Now, enjoy this episode of the Green Building Matters podcast.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the next episode of the Green Building Matters podcast. Really excited for today's guest. A really thought-provoking conversation around, zero net energy and how do we really adjust our behaviors and accept that as a society. So James Geppner coming to us from New York. James, thanks for joining us.
Hi, thank you for having me.
And James, you're the executive director at Erase 40. I can't wait to unpack what you're doing there and some of the cool experiments and just some better questions for us to ask. But just, take us back. Where'd you grow up? Where'd you go to school? Where'd you get this start?
I grew up all over the place, Illinois, Wisconsin, Colorado primarily. And I guess as related to this, I moved around a lot. So I felt like I was constantly a student of behavior, even as a pretty young kid, noticing how incredibly strange it was. So I think from a fairly early age, what I'm doing now seemed pretty inevitable.
No, it's interesting because, as I understand, you went to NYU. So have you always been around New York? I mean, this is where you've been most of your life.
Yeah, after I moved here for college, I've been away from the New York area for about probably a week in total since 30 years ago.
No, I'm in New York City quite a bit. I know you're just north of the city. Talk about that early career, though, because, we all have different paths and then we end up to where we're hopefully most passionate with our work. But, what were some of those early career opportunities for you?
I guess, I've had a unusual career. So my first job was in the film industry, basically pitching projects to the film studios for producers that had deals with the different studios. So basically my job was to cull through an enormous number of potential projects, books, plays, newspaper articles, and look for basically that idea and then sell it through really, really hard in the studio. Basically, there's, studio executives have an enormous number of ideas that come across their desk. So in a given day, I'm looking at anywhere from 10 to 30 story ideas. And as soon as I figure out this is the one, then I call a studio executive and basically get them to act with urgency and buy that project immediately for the producer that I work for to make into a film.
Oh, that's so cool. I mean, I think a lot of us, we have different backgrounds than we finally got to where we are. But, just looking at your bio, I mean, some work with Paramount Pictures and Warner Brothers. And I'm sure you said it, you had to go through a lot of different pitches and concepts. And then, maybe that exposed you to a lot of different things. And then you got into consumer behavior after that, right? And you spent a lot of time.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. And the question with a film is always, besides what do you want to see, is what will make a person leave their home when they can just as easily, sit on their couch and watch television. So without even realizing, I was basically asking a sort of very fundamental behavioral question, which is what motivates people? What does so in a very short time span and creates, because you might think of each film as a mass social movement. You, in a very short window of time, you introduce them to an idea and you hope that out of the people that have seen that idea, that in the first weekend or so, about 10 million people leave their homes, pay money, again, to go to a theater when just as easily they could sit on their couch.
Big ask, yeah. And then, as I understand it, a lot more with consumer behavior and then a strategist, entrepreneurial journey. So when did you get the sustainability bug along that path?
I think I've always had it. So, my grandparents owned a campground when I was a little kid, and I was pretty much given free rein around this massive area. So whatever the season was, canoeing or ice skating. And so I spent a lot of time outdoors. And the natural world always made sense to me and was a thing that I just thought was stunning. And people's behavior I always thought was odd. And so those two things kind of, I think, inevitably lead you to an interest in the environment.
Yeah, absolutely. Was that camp, was that like in New York, like upstate New York? Or was
No, that was lower Wisconsin.
Oh, Wisconsin. Very nice. Beautiful out there. Yeah. So sustainability minded, you've always had it. You've always enjoyed the outdoors and you've had this behavior background. And so who along the way maybe had some influence on you? Did anyone open any doors? Did you have any mentors or anyone that you followed?
Yeah, I was extraordinarily fortunate in any number of ways. I've had people from a very early age invest basically give me an enormous amount of authority. So it was strange to be, very young and then be handed, responsibility that, in a lot of cases, people much older than myself was generally handed. So early on in my film career, I ran one of the offices in New York, nice. Connected to a studio. And the first studio producer that I worked with basically put me in charge of the literary department in New York. So that was an enormous thing to be actually at the age of, 25, 26, to be basically given a multi-million-dollar budget to purchase literary material and to basically decide what that producer was going to spend their time making by picking those projects and also by rejecting projects.
Yeah, absolutely. You need someone to take that leap of faith with you and just kind of give you that break, so to speak. Right.
Yeah. Well, it's an interesting thing for someone, for a producer who's made a number of movies and is very successful to say, you tell me whether this project just came in from Robert Redford or some really great writer is a movie or not. And to be in the position where you need to be very concise and tell your boss that this project is terrible. Don't get involved in it. I don't care what that actor, producer, writer says. It's awful, and, basically state something with conviction.
Yeah. What I'm hearing, James, is, give your opinion and keep it concise because then you can work better together with those that are giving you a chance. So that's pretty cool.
I think, I think it's more than an opinion though. It's having conviction around something so that others will join you in your effort.
Yeah, you're right. That's a better word, conviction. I love that. Tell me about some of your achievements along the way. What stands out? What's on the highlight reel?
Well, I think, the thing that I'm doing right now is pretty high up there. Setting up a couple of movies and working with different people in the industry, that was pretty fun. And now, partnering with behaviorists to develop programs that can really launch passive house and zero energy building industry, I think is pretty exciting.
Yeah. No, thank you. From launching movies to what you're doing here with the Race 40. So yeah, that's a good segue to fast forward to today. But one consumer behavior question for the lay consumer here. Tell us, is consumer behavior and focus groups and so much more. It's everywhere in every industry. We don't always see it. Can you give us a couple examples of some of the work you did? And then, we're going to talk about a Race 40.
So in terms of work that I've done, I think, consumer behavior, I don't know if that's the label I would put on it, but let me talk about consumer behavior for a second, because I think I can present a good contrast here. Okay. So when people study consumer behavior, they think about consumer products, and the emphasis or the focus tends to be on a set of consumer preferences, stated and known consumer preferences. That is very different than focusing on how a person might make some important decision in their life. So rather than saying, I like brand A or brand B, saying, how can we predict whether or not this person who just signed up for a gym membership will stick to a gym regimen? Okay. How can we predict if this person, how much energy will they use in their home? How can we predict if this person who's just been prescribed a medication will take it? So rather than looking at particular, I want to say, very small bore preferences that drive large companies and consumer products markets, asking much more profound questions that really drive the direction of society, which are what makes us do certain things that are fundamental to the quality of our lives.
Now that you painted a great picture there. It's not just to get someone to make a purchase. It's that predictive of how they're going to use it, where they're going to go with it, what's the next trend, and that future thinking. So what are some of your favorite, behavioral science experiments?
Well, there's I mean, the thing about behavioral science experiments is that they're funny. They have an aspect of it. If you read a paper, the papers are generally written in a way where the comedy is not evident. But if you really think about the design of these experiments, you quickly find the comedy. And one of the reasons I ended up getting into this is because I think it was my freshman or sophomore year of college, I was walking in the basement of the university library, and I came across basically a social science journal that I just picked up, and I end up sitting on the floor for weeks on end and just pulling volume after volume off the shelves and sitting there on the floor and reading these experiments because they were so funny. So just the level of pure joy, that's where a lot of stuff comes from. So there are any number that are really interesting. One of the ones that I guess it's not funny, but it is idiosyncratic, is an experiment that George Lowenstein talks about that he ran, I believe, as part of his program at Carnegie Mellon University, where he takes two groups that are going to go on a hike the next day. And the first group is just going to the first group is asked how much water they should pack for the hike. Otherwise is given, there's no other sort of change in their behavior. There's no other thing to influence them. They're just asked how much water will they need on their hike. The second group is put on a treadmill for about 20 minutes. And then they are asked how much water they need. The problem with this experiment, of course, is that even when you describe it, it's kind of obvious what the outcome is. But on a daily basis, it reveals mistakes that we all make. So if you haven't already sort of jumped to the conclusion and see what's going to occur, the people who are on the treadmill were much more accurate in predicting how much water they need.
Sure.
So when we think about the experiments is around empathy gaps, and when we think about gaps in empathy, we normally think about, gaps between different groups of people, or say myself and a person who's an alcoholic, and I don't have a way of understanding why that person's an alcoholic or how that started, or this person with a low savings rate, or this person with a certain exercise habits. And I fundamentally don't understand that person. But empathy gaps is more than the gap in understanding or gap in empathy between two different people with different life circumstances. It's also, there's a gap between who I am today and who I'm going to be tomorrow morning. So that these hikers didn't actually, even though they themselves were going to be going on the hike, could not actually appreciate what their future selves in a matter of 12 hours were going to be and what they were going to want. So we make these mistakes all the time. We tend to be very, very good decision makers when it comes to thinking about how to maximize our pleasure in the present. But we tend to be very bad at predicting what our needs will be, even a very short time out. So this has a lot of implications when it comes to thinking about how home buyers choose a home, thinking about how renters choose an apartment, thinking about what kind of building developers choose to build. So because basically our point of view can be incredibly inaccurate for what our needs will be in a very short time in the future.
That's great. Let's unpack that. Home buyer, because some listening might be in residential, a lot in commercial, but I think you and I connected just talking residential. Like when I bought my home a little over 6 years ago outside of Atlanta, I asked for the power bills. I asked for the gas bills. I wanted to know what I'm getting into. And that's probably rare. Eventually, hopefully that's mandated when a house sells. But can you educate us a little bit, James, about some questions we should be asking, or just a different approach to risk and ROI? You've even gamified this a little bit. Can you talk about that?
Sure. So a couple of years ago, I started studying, and Race 40 started studying, basically, or asking this question: why wasn't the choice for a zero energy home or a passive home commonplace? Rather than saying sort of, how can the market grow? Why wasn't there, 80, 90, 100% adoption from people who were offered that option when they met with an architect or builder? And basically, so we did quite a bit of research, sat in on meetings, interviewed many, many architects and builders, had hundreds of conversations, talked to people at conferences and so forth, and basically found real consensus about what the problems were, and also did read through a lot of peer-reviewed research. And so we discovered any number of things, but one thing is simply that when any of us make a decision, we tend to make a decision based on what is from a cognitive point of view, what is effortless? So our brain has two systems, system 1, system 2. This is from the work of Daniel Kahneman. He describes this in length. And system 1 is the majority of our mental effort. And it is unconscious. It's outside of our awareness, and it produces an intuition. We like this idea, or this looks like the best choice for me. And then there's system 2, which is deliberative thinking. It's more effort, it's more cognitively expensive, and we tend to use it as sparingly as possible. So in buying a house, we tend to look at information that is effortless, because effortless, from a cognitive point of view, effortlessness feels good. So we look at the list price or the construction costs and we go, oh, that's too expensive, or that's the right price, or, we come to some conclusion. But that is the avoidance of all this other relevant information, because construction cost or list price is actually not an accurate proxy for affordability of the house. And so people tend to lean on that effortless information and basically discount or dismiss entirely other information. And that has entirely to do with the amount of difficulty that this other information involves. So what you did is actually, as far as asking for energy bills, is actually really far outside of the norm, because most people discount it. But if we took those, if we were talking to a head of a company or someone who had to deal in spreadsheets a lot and make large organizational decisions, what they would ask us to do is they would say, give me utility bills and have me do a net present value calculation on all energy and repair costs over the next 30 to 50 years, say, and then do a risk profile, other things that might occur, and assign a cost to those. And that would be the rational choice, is assign all those, add all those costs on top of the list price. So what I just described is obviously really complicated, right? That's a lot of hard work. And so what most people do is the effortless thing instead, which is to focus on the list price and then to compare two options only by that list price, dismissing all other costs associated with ownership. And that, of course, leads people to make faulty judgments about which house is actually more expensive.
Yeah. And for those listening, whether you're buying, whether you're renting, these questions apply to both. And I'm on your website now and looking at the Lucky Game, and I'm going to link to this in the podcast show notes. But I really like this spinner here. You can make a donation and get these. It just helps with the conversation, right? It helps empower you to be thinking of, I didn't think of that. And it shows you that we have to be intentional here. So talk a little bit about Erase 40. You've got some tools there that I'm going to link to, but just want to make sure everybody does go to erase40.org. And James, I'm really impressed by, your mission statement here is very clear, using behavioral science to speed the adoption of climate-safe building. So tell us more about what you're doing day to day.
So, the Lucky Game is actually one of our projects. So that's one of our initiatives. It is a game which basically makes one of the things I described, which is some of that more effortful thinking about what costs come with certain risks, like the risks of there being mold in the walls, or the risk of losing money to energy and repair costs, or the risk of poor air quality and the effect on health. So the spinner game is a way to get people to, in like a matter of 60 seconds to 2 minutes, to be able to, instead of making a long, complicated explanation like the one I'm giving you here, a very simple, take a spin of the spinner and you see these events occur and they're not desirable. But it's in the context of a game. So you're sort of thinking, how do I win this game? So it allows people in a very short amount of time to think about the risks associated with the house. And rather than think about luck, which is how a lot of people approach buying a house, they think, let's hope I'm lucky that I don't need to repair that roof. That might not be a conscious thought, but basically that's what their behavior indicates. So this game is a way to get people to start thinking about those risks, thinking about some of those events, and try to basically make concerted steps to avoid them. And the way to avoid them is obvious based on our mission. It's to opt for a high performance, zero energy or passive house.
So unpack that a little bit. Climate safe buildings, is it important to get a certification, get a label? Is it just some best practices? Is it, zero energy? What's a climate safe building look like to you?
Yeah, it's a great question, because there are all these different standards, and there are a lot of questions out there between architects and builders and some of the different organizations, whether it's USGBC or FIAS or PHI in Germany, about what standard, or the Living Well building challenge, about which standard to adopt. And I'm pretty agnostic about the pathway. So when we say climate safe buildings, what we're really saying is every technology is okay with us as long as it delivers to the buyer, to the funder. So it could be the banks, could be an investor, to the occupant, a certain number of outcomes. So passive house, I think, is maybe the best example, but even that standard, I think, can have a number of improvements which can deliver better outcomes. For instance, having a metal roof saves capital costs later on because of it's more durable than an asphalt roof. That's just one example. So climate safe building is just one that requires minimal energy usage. It isn't a building built to conventional standard that then has a bunch of solar cells on it that does not pass the test. It's one that has a high quality building envelope, continuous fresh air, so there's higher air quality indoors. It has insulation under the slab so that the basement floors are room temperature with the rest of the house. And because it doesn't get moisture inside the walls, it has a more durable wall and roof assembly.
That's a great picture that you painted there for us. I think I would agree. I mean, there's a lot of great rating systems, a lot of great tools, but use those as the best practices. James just listed off a lot of other best practices, but we've got to move towards, I like it, climate safe buildings. And so talk a little more about Erase 40. I understand that you work with architects, you even work with lenders. How do you lend for a zero energy building? You work with developers. So what are some of the other projects you're working on?
So we started by basically analyzing the industry and thinking, why aren't these buildings being adopted at a higher rate? And we just found that there were some missing pieces in the industry. And you might just, through analogy, think of it this way. What if, let's say, passive houses, zero energy building was all under the roof of one company? So if we approach the market the way Apple does or the way Google does, you'd have one CEO, you'd have a CFO, and you'd have all these basically product specialists. Architect, builders, and engineers, in my mind, are the equivalent of Johnny Ives of Apple. Johnny Ives comes up with a great product that creates desire in us and that gives us great outcomes. And lucky for Johnny Ives, that's all he has to do, because that is an amazing feat in of itself. But architects and builders and engineers have this other task, a lot of other tasks. They basically have to do the job of be their own CFO, CEO, their own marketing specialists. And they don't have people analyzing the market and thinking, how do we accelerate this market? How do we cut your sales costs? How do we bring you more clients? How do we basically get the adoption rate higher so that your job is easier and you can spend more time focusing at what you really like to do and what you're expert at? So what we do is basically create different initiatives that help fill in those missing pieces of the market. So one is, as you mentioned, a full-day workshop aimed at lenders to basically teach them the difference between lending to a conventional project and lending to a zero energy project. So we basically went deep in the weeds of their own credit analysis process and looked at their income expense statements when they look at a project, looked at the different risks they analyze, looked at their portfolio and how they track it and how they assign profitability and risk to that portfolio, how they do intake on borrowers, and basically went through and showed them the differences in these different stages of their own process, about how they'd approach what the differences were between a conventional building project and a passive house or zero energy building project were, and also then what they would do differently in a zero energy building case.
That's so great. And I'm sure it's well received, and we hear a lot, it's coming at us, whether we like it or not. Why not speed it up, right? This is a conversation I've been having with some of my podcast guests lately. So that's my next question is, what's a massive breakthrough look like with your mission? Like, instead of waiting on codes, instead of waiting on certain mandates and maybe certain companies to get on board, certain developers, like what would a massive win look like for you, James?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I think about this a lot. From my point of view, and this became more evident when we were designing the lender workshop, this change is bearing down on us like a speeding train. So if I were an architect or a builder not trained in one of the zero energy building technologies, Passive House or one of the others, sure, I would be panicking. I would be going and getting trained right away. What a transformation looks like is that instead of doing an architect or builder doing, let's say, 50 to 100 client meeting or new prospect meetings per year, doing 20 and landing half of them or more, because there are only so many people trained in doing these more attractive type buildings, these buildings that deliver outcomes that conventional buildings don't offer. And what this looks like is what we've seen so many times before, where Airbnb or Uber or the iPhone, where when you look at growth, you don't look at growth from year to year in terms of 5%, 10%, 20%. You look at growth in terms of like 10 times growth from the prior year, year after year, for a string of 5 or 6 years. So, Airbnb, I believe, started somewhere around like 2008. Uber, think about how new Uber is. So market transformations can happen extremely quickly. And there is already a lot of this transformation in the works. And what a Race 40 focuses on is going, let's look at what the barriers to this growth rate really is. And in my view, and what the research directs me to, is that it's not code, it's not cost. Those are not the barriers. The barriers are largely how people perceive this choice and how effective are they in being able to see some of the outcomes that come with these zero energy buildings.
So cool. Really enjoying the conversation here. Well, let's pretend we had a crystal ball. Obviously, your call to action to everyone listening, especially designers, get out in front, Passive House, living, building, challenge, and so much more. But what else is around the corner? Is it doubling down on everything here you're talking about? Is it carbon? Is it zero energy? Or what else do you think we need to be reading up on?
Well, I think we need to think more about how different people look at the situation. I think what's really missing is the conversation between people who have, firms that are relatively small. Even if you have, an architecture firm of, say, 20 people, that's relatively small compared to the size of other companies. And so the experts that you have are very different than you'd have in a company that are 200, 2,000 people. So people that really understand how new markets develop, having more of those conversations, and also looking at things from the point of view of capital investors and lenders, because these buildings have a very different profile for an investor or a lender. And as soon as that understanding about the different profile spreads through that community, that's when transformation really accelerates. So that's what I'd be looking out for, is hearing what people in the finance community start saying about their current risks from conventional buildings, which, the risks are incredible, and compare that risk profile to the risks of a zero energy building. There are actually a lot of emerging forces putting pressure on people in finance to change their practices. And I certainly, if I was a lender, wouldn't want a lot of conventional buildings on my books.
Really fascinating conversation, but you're right. It's happening real fast. Some are already behind. So let's talk about you a little bit more. What are some of your specialties, gifts? What do you think you're best at?
Yeah, I have no idea. Does anybody know what they're good at? I'm not sure.
No, self-awareness is interesting. If you have a little self-awareness, what do you think others might say?
Well, I can tell you the thing I like doing. I like looking at what is a confusing set of information, lots of noise, and being able to say, this is going to occur in a market. To be able to sort of predict through hearing signal through a lot of noise, what's going to occur in a market, what is inevitable, where market transformations and social changes are going to happen. That is a thing that's constantly interesting to me. In the past, it tends to be when I'm talking to friends and after we're done talking about sort of what comedy specials we've talk about, things like, I remember talking about the banking crisis, how that was emerging as early as sort of 2004 and 2005. And we're talking about how before Netflix was a company, about how it was just inevitable that a subscriber model was going to, transform the entertainment industry. So I really like those conversations, the sort of large movement predictions. And basically when you do that, of course, you have to approach it with an enormous dose of humility, saying, here are all the things that I don't know, but try to find some fundamental principles or forces that are really going to exert change over time to be able to kind of see what's going to be occurring. So that's the thing I think about a lot. Whether or not I'm good at it or not is I don't know. I feel like to say that I'm good at it would be full of hubris.
You're well practiced in it. No, that's definitely a unique skill set, and it seems like some of that might have started reviewing all those movie and show pitches back in the day, not just for opinion, but conviction. And so you were doing some of that early on. Do you have any routines or rituals that you go through on a regular basis? Any pro tips?
I do have a routine, and I think it's been an enormous help for me. When I start work every day, I open a blank piece of paper on my computer.
Okay.
And I spend about 20 minutes to an hour and a half with it. And I always end up capturing things because staring at a blank piece of paper is a very interesting experience.
That's really interesting. Yeah, just to get it all out of your head.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly.
That's a pro tip.
You have a thought and then you write it down and you go, is that absurd? Or does that have something to it? You quickly are able to sort out what is an absurdity, some bias, something that's connected to something else that you might be, be on the right trail about. But once you get it on paper, you look at it with very different eyes.
I really like that. That's pretty cool. As we're getting to know each other, James, I'm a fan of the bucket list, of having a bucket list. What are one or two things on your bucket list?
I don't really have a bucket list per se. If I had a bucket list, I guess it would be to kind of be privileged enough to kind of keep doing what I'm doing and to be a person that gets to not only continue to design some of these initiatives, but come up with ideas to design experiments. Another experiment that I like beside the George Lowenstein one is a thing that Dan Ariely talks about in his documentary Dishonesty, which I highly recommend to people because it is both incredibly informative and also hilarious. Dan Ariely is not only brilliant, but he's actually excellent at communicating his ideas. Sure. He purchased a vending machine, and he talks about it in his documentary. He purchased a candy vending machine and put it, I believe, in a college dorm. And he made it so that, it said candy 50 cents, but he rigged it so that when you press the lever, your money would be returned to you and you'd also get the candy. And then he had a big sign on the glass of the vending machine that said, if the machine is broken, please call this number.
Wow. And
then he had a video camera on the vending machine to see what people would do. And it is just, it's just funny.
Yeah, I'm going to check that out. That's another behavioral science experiment. Oh, gosh, I love it. Well, I'm sure there's some other travel and adventure in there too, but it sounds like you're just really loving the work you're doing, and I just really enjoying the conversation here. Let's talk about books. I don't know if you like to listen to books, Audible or something, or maybe pick up a book in your hands, or just publications. What's something you'd recommend, even if it's an older book?
Oh my God, there are so many. I would say, since Dan Ariely is on my mind, Predictably Irrational by Dan Ariely. That is an amazing book. I find one of the things that a book that you don't need to actually read the book because he's interviewed in podcasts and so forth. An author and philosopher, Samuel Sheffield, if I have his name correct, he wrote a book called Death and the Afterlife. And it's not about religion whatsoever. It's actually a pretty terrible title for the content, but it's an amazing book.
Okay.
And it's basically about how the projects of our lives, how we actually get meaning from what we do on a day-to-day basis when we wake up in the morning and feel motivated. The projects of our life depend on, for their meaning, for us to have meaning in them, strangers in the future. That, the thought experiment is if you're a cancer researcher, for example, you're not necessarily hoping that you will cure cancer. What you're hoping is that you will pull forward the research and that you will continue to hand on that baton and make strides so that one day a person in the future will actually make the cure, and the beneficiary of that cure will be is inevitably a person that you will never meet and that will exist in the future. But if that person doesn't exist, then your motivation in the present, even if it's like 10, 50, 100 years earlier, when you wake up in the morning, if you think that stranger isn't going to exist, then that project is utterly divested of meaning, and you lack that motivation to continue it. And this goes for people composing symphonies, writing books, building buildings, designing bridges. The projects of our lives very much depend on benefiting strangers in the future. And when we think about some of the things that we're all doing, which is basically designing the built environment, it's a really interesting thought to have in your head about climate change and about what we can contribute. And even if there wasn't climate change, even taking that off the table, thinking about how we influence the lives of people in the future. And basically, why do we get up in the morning? It all comes down to depending on those strangers for the meaning, for how we feel about ourselves. And what we do.
Definitely thought-provoking. Well, we're going to link to those books. James, thanks for sharing. So as we wrap up here, I always love to ask this question. Is there any advice you wish you'd received sooner or a little earlier in your career, or just any words of encouragement to someone that's listening, jumping into this green building movement, maybe wanting to do more with zero energy buildings and homes? What advice would you give? The thing that just pops into my mind, which I think is like the most honest response, which is that if you have an inkling in the back of your mind about something that's going to occur or some idea to pursue, then don't be dissuaded from it, to really genuinely explore it, because it's very likely that if you tell early people about it, you will do so poorly, not have all of your thoughts together, and be very easy to dissuade. So if you have some inkling, there is something there probably. If there's not, you'll discover it. But to not be overly influenced by those first people that you tell it to. Excellent advice. I love it, man. Tell me about the meeting map. What is that tool for change?
So the meeting map is sales training for architects and builders, and it trains the architects and builders on a process to go through in the first 2 hours of their interaction with the prospective client. So it's a very specific process, and it's one that basically helps that prospective client understand and connect to the value of a passive house or zero energy building. So selling a conventional house and selling a zero energy house they're very different things. So historically, architects have been in one kind of situation with selling a conventional house or building, but now find themselves in a very different situation with how to talk about this technology. So the meeting map is training for how to handle these meetings to really minimize the amount of errors that prospect has about seeing the value of the passive house, and helps them make a clear connection to the outcomes so that the meeting for that architect or builder is a lot easier, a lot more effective. They're a lot more likely to win the client, and that client is more likely to choose a zero energy building or a passive house. Wow.
Yeah, it sounds like not just great training, but a checklist. You really showed the business case and follow the kind of the cash flow. It just, because, that's the word I heard is sales. You got to sell it, why this and why now, why on this project. So it sounds like you cover all of that.
Yeah, exactly. Well, one of the things is really, it's just, people, they might have 100 meetings per year, but in our research, we interviewed hundreds of people and really collected ideas and used research. So we have a tool and a process now that, rather than being ad hoc, is systematic, comprehensive, and is really targeted to some of the barriers that people have in choosing a passive house or zero energy house and to hiring that particular architect.
Well, you've got a sales system set up there that we all need. And if I were going to invest in a sales system like that, I'd probably want to do it with a nonprofit like yours and help the cause. So yeah, I can't wait to link to that also. Everyone check out the meeting map. Again, we're referencing erase40.org. This has been James Geppner, the executive director of Erase 40. I want you guys to check out his LinkedIn profile. He's got some white papers there to download, but also go to erase40.org and make sure you click on the tools for change, because definitely want everyone here listening, try to support this cause, get some of the games, gamify these conversations, be thinking about the risk questions we're probably not asking. And James, just keep up the good work. Thanks for being on the podcast.
Thank you very much for having me. I really enjoyed the conversation.
I just want to say thank you to our loyal listeners. We actually are celebrating over 1 year here on the Green Building Matters podcast. Me and the entire team were stoked and just so glad you continue to listen every Wednesday morning to a new interview with a green building professional here in this industry, or just some pro tips that we want to make sure that you are getting straight from us, straight to you. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Green Building Matters podcast. At gbes.com, our mission is to advance the green building movement through best-in-class education and encouragement. Remember, you can go to gbes.com/podcast for any notes and links that we mentioned in today's episode. And you can actually see the other episodes that have already been recorded with our amazing guests. Please tell your friends about this podcast. Tell your colleagues. And if you really enjoyed it, leave a positive review on iTunes. Thank you so much, and we'll see you on next week's episode.